So you saw that, Nicole. We're going to have hot mics now.
Testing 1 2 testing. Hot mic. Watch what you say.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here at the Sac State Downtown Center. We're so grateful for your presence. This is a very, very important issue for us as we are very focused as a center at Sac State on the issue of equity. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Jamie Taylor. I'm the director of the California State Senate Fellows Program, based out of the Center of California Studies at Sac State. We are located in the Capital community, which strategically positions us as a center to be the link between the university and the 3 branches of government. So how do we do what we do as a center? First, it is our mission to bridge academia with government in the service of strengthening our democracy. And when we think about democracy, is it democracy for all of us or democracy for some of us? That's one of the things that we'll try to get into today. As a gateway to public service, leadership, and responsible public policy making, the Center for California Studies offers 64 placement opportunities for the executive branches of government, and there's 18 there. Judicial, there are 10 fellows that are representing the Center for California Studies in respective courts up and down the state. There are 18 Assembly Fellows and in the legislature and 18 Senate Fellows. Our 4 critical staffing fellowship programs represent some of the most distinguished experiential learning programs, not just in California, but also throughout the nation. We also organize high-impact speaker series events like this one right here today. In 2019, we have already looked at payday loans and student debt, which focused on inequity, inequality, and poverty in California. We've also looked at current trends and future opportunities in the juvenile justice system, and California as a nation state, where we have looked at ways in which our state attempts to reconcile the demands of globalization. Lastly, we also fund applied research funded by CSU. For those in our audience, please feel free to write down and send your comments and suggestions. There's a phone number right here on this screen to your right. Please text your questions if you have any to that phone number. It's 916-469-5883. You could do that throughout today's presentation. The sooner the better. In the second half of our discussion today, we'll be going much more deeper and wider into the question and answer period. So we won't address any of your questions until the second half. But please send them now if you choose. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the executive director of our program, Leonore Elling. Yes. Thank you, Leonore, for making this happen. And for a lot of the work that we've done as a center on equity. Appreciate your direction and your leadership on that issue. I'd also like to thank the 3 directors of our other programs, Megan Thoral, who runs the judicial program, Brian Aguilar, who runs the executive fellowship program, and Pam Chu, who runs the assembly fellowship program as well. Thank you. I would be remiss if I forgot to mention the people that actually take the idea and make it happen and make it possible for us to be here to eat, both and receive food for thought and food for our bellies. Starting with Ariel, Thank you so much, Ariel. Ariel's in the back. She's been making everything happen with this program. Thank you so much, Ariel. Appreciate all of your service. Nadia and Jill, Sarah, thank you so much. I also want to take a moment to thank Nathan Dietrich, who handles state and federal issues on behalf of Sac State. Thank you, sir. And also the creative folks over there who are handling all of the live streaming, Jose and Susan, and Patty, who is taking the minutes. Thank you so much.
Nice.
And Tyler for keeping the lights on. Thank you. All right. And now, without further ado, I'd like to just quickly introduce our moderator for today's event. His name is Ali Cooper. Ali is a social and economic justice advocate who has worked in that space for over 2 decades. Mr. Cooper has served as a lobbyist for AFSCME, and he has coordinated political operations for SEIU. Mr. Cooper is the principal owner of Justice Development Group, a consultant firm serving cannabis entrepreneurs, real estate owners, and industry brands. Ali is not a Senate fellow, but we would love to have you apply. Ali is a senior fellow at the American Leadership Forum. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I want to thank you and the center and the entire staff and the leadership for hosting this dynamic speaker series. You know, California, we know that California leads the nation in thoughtful and progressive policies that help to alleviate suffering and that improve the human condition. And in fact, we know that California's policies oftentimes set the tone for what other states do in terms of implementing policy solutions. The genesis of today's dialogue focused on closing the equity resource gap would not be possible if it were not for the countless individuals and advocates from across the state who've worked with great effort and great energy to ensure that the community, our community, as the state of California, addresses past wrongs and builds a path towards prosperity for a whole class of folks who've been harmed. We honor the good works of groups like the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the Urban Partnership, the Southern California Coalition, the Original Equity Group, the American Civil Liberties Union, the California State Conference of NAACP, and countless of other leaders. There is an abundant amount of research which confirms that nothing has contributed more to the systematic mass incarceration of people of color in the United States than the war on drugs. That methodical, systematic approach to criminalize a class and a race of individuals has subjected generations of Americans to adverse life outcomes. The harm leveled against black and brown communities as a result of severely punitive laws has cast a dark and ugly cloud in neighborhoods across this nation. In California, fortunately, Proposition 64 passed in 2016, and it included components to begin to address some of these harms. For example, the decriminalization efforts within the voter-approved statute was completely retroactive. So what does that mean? It means that cannabis activities, which had been felonies, had been reduced in penalties and or made completely legal. So not only do those reductions in these new penalties mean that people in the future will not be subject to the same adverse impacts, but those folks who had previously been convicted of a felony or misdemeanor cannabis arrest or conviction now have the opportunity to have their records completely reduced or expunged. In this historic moment, so today, because of persistent and diligent organizing by individuals and communities most impacted by harmful enforcement policies, we're at a tipping point. Not only acknowledging the harms that were done to community and communities across the state, but in adopting radical policy solutions that begin to correct historical wrongs. I'm really hopeful that today's conversation is a conversation beyond Social Equity 101. We've had plenty Equity 101 conversations. I'm hopeful that the crux of the conversation today is about growing meaningful pathways that create an abundance of economic opportunities, a bounty of economic opportunities for a generation of new entrepreneurs who otherwise would have been locked out of the opportunity to create better life outcomes for themselves. You know, today we're joined by the esteemed Senator Bradford, who's dedicated his life's work in the service of others. Mr. Bradford's legislation, Senate Bill 1294, is a radical approach to institutionalize a frame of support services that have the ability to jumpstart social equity programs across the state of California. Senate Bill 1294 is a national model for the role government ought to play in ensuring the success of entrepreneurs. We have, so we're very delighted to have Senator Bradford with us today. We are delighted also to have, although she's running a little bit late, we just got a text, Ms. Nicole Elliot, representing Governor Gavin Newsom's office. Nicole has been a steady activator in helping to inform local and state cannabis regulatory framework. We welcome Mr. Ramon Garcia, Chief Equity Officer at the original Equity Group, who will spend some time today informing the discussion about real-life, on-the-ground experiences of equity operators and aspiring equity applicants. We are grateful and thankful to be joined by the really bright tactician, Max Mikalonis of K Street Consulting. Max staffed the historic Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act under Assemblymember Rob Bonta. Last but certainly not least, one of my favorites, we're joined today by author of some really groundbreaking research, equity cannabis policy, Ms. Leslie Valencia. Ms. Leslie Valencia's body of work is helping local and state policymakers engage this issue from a supremely informed position. Today's format, folks, so we'll just get right into it. Today's format will be brief presentations from each presenter and speaker. We'll then engage in an open-ended dialogue at strengthening social equity programs and hopefully explore more ideas about how to grow these programs and close the equity resource gap. As Jamie noted, there is a number on the screen to your right. We're hopeful that you will text that number with any questions you have. And when we open up the forum for the open-ended dialogue, we'll be reading those questions from the podium here. And without further ado, at this time, I invite the grand Senator Stephen Bradford to share about his historic legislation and his continued work in this space. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And my mother would laugh at grand. Okay, she thinks I don't do much of anything but run my mouth. But hey, first let me thank Sac State and the Center for California Studies for putting this event on and convening this panel. To all the panelists that are here today, I commend you for all the great work that you have done. To Mr. Cooper, also to Jamie Taylor and his exceptional work that he does on a daily basis with our Senate fellows in Sacramento and the Capitol. So give him a round of applause as well. But I'm honored to be here and have a discussion on this issue of equity. It's an issue that should concern us regardless of what the topic is, what the industry is. And if you look at my body of work as a local elected official, as a member of the California Assembly and now in the Senate, equity has always been part of the legislation I've done, whether it's in the insurance industry that we just passed, the equity bill for contracting and procurement in a utility space, and a roundabout way, the piece of legislation that was signed on Monday, SB 206, the Fair Pay to Play Act, which I and Nancy Skinner authored that bill, but it was about equity and fairness for African American, well, for all athletes and women as well, because they are excluded many times when you talk about the opportunity to make money while in college. Every other student can make money. So I say all that to say I'm concerned with equity, I'm concerned with fairness, I'm concerned that we have a balanced approach. But as it relates to this issue of cannabis, it shouldn't be missed on anyone that here's an industry that's just a little bit more than a year and a half in its existence, and the dominant force are white men in this industry. And that should concern each and every one of us. And if this industry is going to succeed, it has to reflect the great diversity of California, the great diversity of this nation. So that's why I introduced 1294, because I saw the lack of diversity in this area. The promise of billions of dollars, and those promises should be afforded to every Californian. Again, regardless of your race, your gender, your beliefs. And this is what we're striving for, but so far we know that's not the case. And I'm excited about having these dialogues because many times we're confronted with the question of how do we enter this space, and many times we don't have the answers, but by convening dialogue and discussions like this, we can share ideas with the folks who work in the industry directly, because I tell folks, I as a legislator am not an expert in your industry, but I am one who can advocate for fairness and balance and again, equity in this space. And it's important that we have it, because if we were talking about the criminalization of cannabis, it'd be nothing but black and brown people in the room. And that's the reality. And so I'm excited about being here today. I'm excited about what we hope to achieve through this dialogue, but also about another piece of legislation I still on the governor's desk, and I would hope all of you guys would call the governor's office in the next couple of days and ask them to sign SB 595, which is a fee waiver and deferral bill that will again help individuals enter this space. But one thing I'm going to caution us about, and when we introduced 1294 last year, it was only 4 cities in the state that had equity programs: Sacramento, San Francisco, Oakland, and LA. Today, there are 15 plus that have looked at it. My concern is that some of these cities are only doing it because we now have millions of dollars on the table. And I want to make sure that we're not using people of color, women, as social lubricants to access these state dollars. And that's real, because it has happened. We've seen it in this space. We've seen it in the utility space. We want to make sure that these businesses are truly owned and operated by people of color, by women, but most importantly by those communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs. We all know all too well, people want to do business with people they're familiar with, people in their own communities, and that's what we should be striving for. So I'm going to stop there because I know it's a lot more we can see on this issue.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. You know, we've mentioned we're here because of the overwhelming amount of support from community-based organizations and advocates who've said loud and clear that more must be done. And fortunately for the community and proponents of getting this done the right way, we have a strong advocate in Governor Gavin Newsom. We also have a very dedicated, very smart and thoughtful person working to achieve Governor Newsom's priorities in this space. That's Ms. Nicole Elliot, and so we're delighted to have you here with us today, Nicole, and I now sort of turn the mic over to you, and if you could sort of share with us some of your great work in this space as well.
Sure. So thank you guys for having me here today. My apologies for being tardy. I had overlapping meetings, and then I ate a cookie because I'm growing a human. So I'm really hungry. So thank you. Just a little quick background on me. I know you have my bio, but I was able to join the governor's office in late February of this year. Prior to that, I served as the director for the first ever Office of Cannabis in the city and county of San Francisco, and had the honor and privilege of working on the regulatory framework for that, which did include and does include equity at the forefront, as well as working very closely with industry, individuals who want to participate in the industry to understand how equity works in that space in the context of this conversation. So moving to the state gave me a really great opportunity to incorporate that into the work that I do every day here with senators, assembly members, the governor, and the broader sort of stakeholder community outside of Sacramento. So with that, I wanted to just give you a sense of where the governor's coming from on this issue. This is an issue he is deeply, deeply committed to. I think you saw that in the framework of Proposition 64, which not only included legalization, but also included decriminalization and the opportunity for expungement and sentence reductions. Since then, we've obviously seen third parties really step in and incorporate proactive expungement opportunities for jurisdictions, which is something we deeply support as well from the administration standpoint. It also included earmarking of tax revenue for communities that had been impacted by the war on drugs, not just for participation in the cannabis industry, but to reinvest in those communities. You saw an announcement, I believe, last week around approximately $29 million being granted to predominantly, community-based organizations to aid in the rebuilding of those communities from a workforce standpoint, from a mental health services standpoint, from a reentry services standpoint. That is obviously going to be ongoing and build over time as tax revenue hopefully continues to increase in this space. But that is definitely a commitment that was made through Prop 64 to ensure that we're taking tax revenue that's coming out of this industry and putting it back into the communities that really deserve it most. So there's that. Beyond that, he created this position that I now hold, and he definitely wanted to see equity be a component of that. So having, as I said, having had that experience in San Francisco has allowed me to now bring that experience to the state, work with partners like Senator Bradford on those issues, front load that policy objective as well in all of the work that we're doing to develop systems. So that is another thing. And then, of course, in the budget, we've seen significant allocations that go towards equity in the cannabis space. $15 million from the governor this year, another 15 from Senator Bradford, which is very exciting and definitely something that he's pressing us to get out this fiscal year. So, yeah, it's a collective effort. And then just so you guys know, internally, when we talk about industry engagement and how we structure our thinking, we think of it through three pillars. We think of it access to licensure, enforcement, and equity. And obviously equity touches very deeply on both of those other two pillars. But this is something that is how we structure everything that we think about, how we think about resourcing, how we think about administration, and the development of those systems. So I just wanted to flag that as well. And with that, I think that gives you a general sense of where the governor's office is coming from. This is a topic, as I indicated, that is a regular course of our discussion every day, as it should be in every forum. But in this sense, definitely in the cannabis space, and it's something that we appreciate all the partnership, thought partnership, a resource partnership in the space as well. So it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today.
Thank you, Ms. Elliott. Ensuring the success of equity entrepreneurs requires policymakers get the rules right. Crafting regulatory framework, of course, that promotes and protects the interests of rectifying and really fixing historic harms. It also requires ensuring that entrepreneurs are provided a foundation for success. This really means navigating tedious regulatory language while also having a solid grasp on general business practices. Mr. Garcia's mission has been to guide aspiring equity applicants and operators on this path towards success, and has sort of built a statewide curriculum and model on sort of what this looks like. So I'd like to hear more, and the group would like to hear more from Ramon on some of your work in this space as well.
Well, I want to first thank you for this platform. Thank all the panelists here for being here. I don't have a large title, kind of keep it that way on purpose, so I can say what I want to say with ultimate truth and not any repercussions. So when we talk about equity, first of all, I've been a boots kind of on the ground activist for equity for the past 5 years, both on the state and local levels. I helped give language and testimony and work with Oakland, San Francisco, and some of the other local community local communities that created equity programs. And so Oakland was the first, and that created the conversation across the state, but even more nationwide. And now even that conversation is drifting worldwide. And so being a longtime activist, my dad was a civil rights activist. My life kind of completely changed by colonialism and these policies, racist policies that we deal with. So when we're talking about equity or any of this, we're talking about the damage of the war on drugs, we're talking about racist policies that have gotten us to where we are today historically, we're talking about colonialism, right, and what that did, and we can put various different titles, but those policies led us to today, where we are today. That created the isms, the sexism, the classisms, the whatever ism you want. So ultimately, when we want to bridge that gap and correct those ills that the war on drugs created, the war on drugs is just a symptom of all this, right? And so we have to look at it from a greater perspective. We have to look at colonialism and the damage that it did to communities around the world of color, and then the only way we're gonna counteract that is by counteracting what that damage did, all right? So with equity and specifically, it's just a symptom of all that, right? It created the lack of access to educational opportunities, to creating and holding on to generational wealth, job opportunities, real estate, all of those things that allow us as communities to empower ourselves to take care of our communities, right? And this was systemic. We know this, right? It's been admitted. And so we have to use those same tactics to dismantle that. So it's larger than cannabis itself. We're talking societally, right? And when we want to create inclusion, then we have to change all of those policies that created that disenfranchisement, that created that damage. And so, like, that's been my battle this whole time, is about the larger picture. Cannabis was used as a tool to infringe upon our rights in those communities, which created this damage. And it went further than just cannabis. It was just the key that opened the door to lead to so many more abuses of our communities. And so in that same respect, we have to use this as a key. We have the opportunity to use this as a key to fix those. Should it just be on the cannabis industry? No. Ultimately, it was our government policies and our enforcement agency policies that created the war on drugs and created the damage that the war on drugs created. So should it be on us as a community to fix that damage? Yes, we need to be implicit, but ultimately we didn't create that damage and we didn't create those policies. So the government and our enforcement agencies should be just as engaged in fixing those problems, because they were implicit in that. So when I advocated on the state level and local levels for equity, I also testified and said, look, if we don't place this in the foundation of these laws, we can't approach it later. And if we do, it's going to be a problem. We're creating a larger problem for ourselves by setting a foundation and then going back and trying to fix and add things to that foundation. So yes, has there been resources applied to equity? Yes. Is it comparable to the damage? No way. $100 million plus went to enforcement, $15 million went to equity. If we continue to engage it in that way, we're not going to create any kind of effect or fix the problems that we want to. We have to engage it with the same amount of vigor and the same amount of passion and the same amount of resources and money that was put towards these policies enforcement to fix the problems. So we have to engage state, city, county resources. We have multiple amount of resources, not about adding more dollars. We have Sacramento State, we have our state school systems, we have the SBAs, we have state-owned, city-owned, and county-owned real estate and resources that can be pushed towards really creating some kind of pathways to creating this inclusivity that we want in this industry, but even more that we want in all of our industries. We want this societally. We want equity to go beyond just cannabis. Equity should be a stakeholder of our society in everything that we do. Does that mean it's a handout? No, it's just an equal opportunity to have that advantage, to be able to feed ourselves and create our own programs and fix our own things. So this platform allowing us to come to the table and express what our communities need is bridging that gap between the policies and the intent of those policies and what their actual effect is on those communities. And so, again, I appreciate you guys for being at the table and giving me this platform to be able to engage in this way and express that.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And as we get into the open-ended conversation, we are going to want to hear more about the supports and the role that both local government and the private sector ought to be playing in ensuring the success of equity operators. You know, it's really important for us all. We can't assume that we all have the same foundational knowledge about what's got us here on the policy. So I want to make certain that we introduce, and I'm not surprised at all to be presenting or introducing the next speaker. It feels like a lifetime ago, back in the day when Mr. Max Mikalonis was one of the brightest young interns in the Ask Me California Policy Unit. Today, Max leads Cannabis Advocacy along with his esteemed colleagues over at K Street Consulting. He's a principled and a values-driven leader and a thought leader on these matters. We couldn't have had a better person in the early stages of helping to craft our state policy. Mr. Mikalonis is going to ensure that we all have some foundational understanding of California's existing regulatory framework. So, Max, I turn it over to you, sir.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ali, for the introduction, and you're too kind with your words. I do want to start with some thank yous for the other members of the panel, specifically Nicole. Thank you for your commitment on this issue, both within SF and with the Newsom administration and the governor's work on this. Senator Bradford, you picked up where Prop 64 stopped and continued to go and ensure that equity was not forgotten by this topic. Ramon, you've been on the ground working to make sure that equity works and helping develop these programs and bring businesses to the table. And Leslie, you're doing some critical analysis to help us understand what does success look like with equity and how do we evaluate and move these programs forward. So thank you. I'm really happy to be on the panel with all of these esteemed colleagues. Brief background on myself. I was a staffer in the legislature starting in 2012 until 2017. In 2015, I was a staffer on the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, or MCRSA. MCRSA was the precursor to Prop 64, or AUMA, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. With the drafting of MCRSA, which was on medical cannabis only, creating a medical cannabis framework. Previously, we'd had the collective model that had been put into place in 2003 by Senator Leno's SB 420 that had created a defense from prosecution that allowed there to be retail, allowed there to be dispensaries and production of cannabis. It wasn't a license, it wasn't legal, it was just a defense from prosecution, an affirmative defense that was built on Prop 215, which was the 1996 ballot measure that legalized medical cannabis in California. So some 19 years after Prop 215 passes in 1996, California gets around to creating a regulatory system to try to go and tame and bring in, create a structure for our already existing cannabis market. And that regulatory system was MCRSA. Clearly, it was trying to create a regulatory system from the ground up, and hindsight is 20/20 on this. I think folks can recognize that. But we worked with local government, law enforcement, organized labor, cannabis industry, and social justice advocates and others to try to craft that first framework, knowing that it would go and drastically impact how the pending ballot measure, what would become Prop 64 would be drafted. Additionally, after Prop 64 passed in November of 2016, there was the reconciliation process through the budget in SB 94 to create what's now known as MAUCRSA, the Medicinal and Adult Use Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, MAUCRSA. That was SB 94 of 2017. It was through the budget process that they reconciled the two state cannabis laws. Talking about the core aspects of MAUCRSA, there's several places I can go from here, but let's start with dual licensing. MAUCRSA at its core required both state licensure and local licensure or authorization in order to go and operate an adult use or medicinal cannabis business. That meant that you did not just need to get your state permit from one of the state regulatory authorities, which we'll get into in a moment, but you need to have a sign-off from your city or county, one of those 482 cities and 58 counties you need to have sign-off from in order to operate for cannabis and get a cannabis license to be state legal. Additionally, we had a multi-agency approach with the goal of which was to go and try to utilize existing resources. That's created some unforeseen challenges, certainly since then, but at the time the data was the Bureau of Cannabis Control would be created under the Department of Consumer Affairs. The BCC would regulate distribution, testing, retail, delivery. Additionally, the Department of Public Health would house the Manufactured Cannabis Safety Branch, which would regulate the manufacturing processes, and then the Department of Food and Agriculture would regulate the cultivation of cannabis. And so we divided the responsibility up, going on who had existing understanding and frameworks for licensing from the three departments, with an ag perspective on cultivation, a manufacturing perspective from public health, and a consumer protection, testing, and retail perspective from the Bureau of Cannabis Control under the Department of Consumer Affairs. Right now we're up to 17 different licenses total issued by the state, 17 different types of licenses. For comparison, ABC at this point is over 50 licenses. So we're not yet at alcohol levels, but we are certainly getting quite a few. There's 5 different cultivation tiers, and in some of those tiers there's up to 3 different types of licenses covering different sizes and covering different cultivation methods, from indoor grown to grown in a greenhouse or with light deprivation to being grown outdoors in the full sun. Each of those licenses has a different fee. Each of those licenses has a different square footage requirement for each of the tiers of those licenses. There's also a nursery license. Additionally, within manufacturing, we now have type 6, type 7, N, and P. And cultivation is also the processing license, which doesn't actually grow it and just goes and processes, trims, packages, and otherwise cleans up cannabis that's cultivated elsewhere. Manufacturing, we've got 4 license types. We've got the type 6, which is a non-volatile extraction. This is a CO2 extraction or water hash extraction. Essentially, that's is generally supposed to have a lower risk of safety, lower fire risk from the solvents that are being used. This is in contrast to type 7, which is volatile solvent extraction. That is primarily used for butane hash oil extraction, which you can hear about in the news about these honey oil labs exploding, or this type of public safety, health and safety issue from unlicensed home extraction using butane, which remains a felony to go do that in the state. Additionally, then under the Bureau, we had the testing lab license. We have retail and non-storefront retail or delivery licenses. We have distribution for the supply chain. Products move from cultivation to manufacturing or distribution. They're tested at distribution and then moved to retail or delivery, where they're moved to the final consumer. And then there's the micro business license, which is a sort of a Prop 64 license that combines several of the different license types. And then lastly, there's the special event license for events such as the Emerald Cup and some of the High Times events. They go and allow for businesses to connect with consumers directly. This system replaced the affirmative defense SB 420 collective model, which was officially phased out in January of this year. The language in Malcursa and Macursa had gone and said 1 year after licenses start to be issued and regulations are finalized, we will go and, or the emergency regulations are finalized, we will go and lapse the legal protection of the collective model. So that at this point, if you're engaging in commercial cannabis activity, you're either under one of those licenses or you're unlicensed and then breaking state law on a misdemeanor or felony level generally, or infraction. Lastly, because there's 3 licensing agencies, there are 3 sets of regulations governing all of those agencies. The statute really is like the bones, the requirements. It's the framework, but the regulations are the muscles. The regulations are the day-to-day, week-to-week, what industry has to know. And so there are over 330 pages, or over 300 pages of regulations between the 3 licensing authorities. So it's quite a bit to manage, especially if you conduct cannabis activities in all 3 areas. And you need to have a working understanding of those regulations in order to go and operate your business in a compliant fashion. You can find those regulations at cannabis.ca.gov. When talking about the regulations, I just want to give you examples of some of the things the regulations cover, because it's anything under the sun. If you can think of it, there's a regulation for that. Everything from premises and facility design, who are the owners or who are the financial interest holders that are interested in the business. Those have to be disclosed. Are there any prior convictions? When you're going and applying for a license, those have to be disclosed. How, fortunately, under Malcursa and reconciliation, cannabis convictions are not disqualifying, which is very helpful to allow folks that previously were in the cannabis industry and had a conviction to go and be able to continue. You need standard operating procedures for every different type of activity you do. There's security requirements, hours of operation, rigorous testing for pesticides, heavy metals, mycotoxins, other contaminants, residual solvents, and foreign matter. There's a track and trace system that's administered by the Department of Food and Agriculture, which tracks all of the cannabis grown and produced and packaged throughout the entire supply chain from, quote, seed to sale. We're now at the point where I believe we're at probably 90+%, if not more, of licensees are in annual or provisional licenses, so they're all getting onboarded into track and trace. Additionally, there's extensive requirements on packaging, labeling, child resistance, mandatory disclaimers, requirements on advertising of products and billboards, dosing requirements and limitations, merchandising, destruction of property, record keeping, and keeping those records for 7 years, and last but not least, requirements about the attire that retail employees can wear, for example, such as they should not be unclothed and you should not be able to see the, quote, cleft of the buttocks. That's BCC Regulation 5806. And by the way, there's an event happening in Orange County this week that I think probably violates that. But jumping on from the state down to the local side, there's 482 cities and 58 counties in the state. SF is a city and a county, so that's 539 jurisdictions in total. Roughly 3/4 of those jurisdictions presently have bans on retail. That means that, let's be clear, you can have a ban on retail, you can have a ban on licensed, legal, tested, taxed cannabis retail. You're not banning actual sales. You're not banning consumption of cannabis in those jurisdictions. You're banning the legal market access. And at a time, just to digress slightly, at a time when there's a vape crisis going on, at a time when a lot of the vaping and a lot of the concerns of the vape crisis have been around what are believed to be illicit market THC vapes and cutting agents potentially in those illicit market products, it's even more critical than ever to go and expand retail access, expand safe consumer access to licensed, tested, taxed product, which currently is not available in 3/4 of jurisdictions in the state. One saving grace and one positive development on that, which was gone and went through the regulations, is Bureau Regulation 5416D. That is a regulation that allows delivery from any licensed retailer or non-storefront retailer into any other jurisdiction in the state. While there's currently a lawsuit from a series of cities that are saying, no, we don't want delivery into any jurisdiction, we want to either we want to be a ban completely because we want to pretend that there's no cannabis if we ban it. Either there's that, or they want, or there's a bit of a protectionism. We want to protect their own licensees. Ultimately, the Bureau of Regulation did come down on the side of delivery freedom and side of consumer access, which is a help, but it's not enough. We still need more local engagement. Lastly, a majority of cities and counties in the state have not licensed the regulated supply chain. There's only a limited number of cities where you can actually go and get one of these local licenses and get in this business. We also had a poll released just this week showing statewide 68% support for adult use cannabis and legalization. That was a UC Berkeley Institute for Governmental Studies poll that came out. And considering Prop 64 only passed with 57% of the vote, it's certainly a move up, and support was a majority across the state, including in San Bernardino and Riverside counties, which was 54% support. So still over majority support in every part of the state. Hopefully that will go and give local governments some courage against the groups I've called the WATCs, W-A-T-C, or What About the Children? Which is the biggest detriment, the biggest challenge that we see when we go and go to local governments and try to get them to regulate, is this cry of, what about the children? Well, licensed, regulated, tested, taxed retailers do not sell to minors. They have protocols, they have to check IDs, they have to record information. You are worried about the illicit market operators. If you shut the legal market out, then the illicit market will sell to the children. Lastly, there's the one big part of Mount Cursa that we haven't touched on yet, which is the taxation, the taxes aspect of it. There are two different types of taxes in Mount Cursa. The first is a cultivation tax. I believe, if I get these wrong, it'll be bad. I want to say it's $9.25 or $8.75 an ounce on $9.25 an ounce on flour, and $2.75 on trim. It's around $148 and $44 respectively for a pound of those different products, whether it's processed flour or trimmings from the flour that's used for extraction generally. And that's a cultivation tax that is paid by the cultivator to the distributor. The distributor, once the product has been passed and tested, pays that to the state. Additionally, there's the excise tax. It's a 15% tax essentially on the retail product. The formula for assessment of that tax is not simple, but it comes down to a wholesale markup, a wholesale price plus a state projected markup is what's assessed at 15% if you're not vertically integrated. So it's enough to give, super simple. And I think my goal of getting at all of this, explaining all of this, is just how difficult it is to run a cannabis business, start a cannabis business in California, particularly if you don't have prior business acumen, particularly if you've spent years of your life locked up. It's going to be much more difficult to go and actually, beyond the initial challenges, this is a difficult industry for folks that are well-resourced and have backgrounds in other industries to get into. So the excise tax, it is collected from retailers, sent back to distribution, sent up to the state. I will say that CDTFA, the Department of Tax and Fee Administration, on a quarterly basis issues these tax numbers. The numbers that they issue are inflated. I can say that because the numbers they issue also put in the sales and use tax from local governments, from the sales and use tax. Have they changed that? Okay. Thank you, Nicole. Under previous years, the numbers have been inflated by adding in the sales and use tax numbers to the CDTFA reports, which are taxes that are not cannabis specific. And so you're attributing them to the cannabis sales, yes, but they aren't earmarked for cannabis purposes the same way. And so, to close, really happy to be here, happy to be part of this conversation. I do think that we need to embrace some, to quote a presidential candidate, some quote big structural change to try and see how we can simplify and move the system forward and make it accessible and really have a successful cannabis market. I know that the governor is committed to having a successful market, and I think we'd love to do it on an accelerated time frame.
Excellent. Thank you, Max. And what we hear is that the regulations are deep, they're vast, and the amount of subject matter experts that you and the team that you need to surround yourself with in order to be mildly successful in this business is something that we've got to address, particularly with our social equity applicants. I think, so this brings us to Ms. Valencia. Ms. Valencia completed one of the most comprehensive studies on equitable cannabis policy. She took a really in-depth look at the city of Oakland's policy and the permitting program within its state, local, and national context. And while we promise this conversation will be a conversation beyond Equity 101, it is really significant that we don't assume that everyone in the room has sort of common knowledge or a foundational understanding of what social equity programs are, and why are we here, and what do they look like. So I'd really like to turn the mic over to Leslie. You've done a lot of work in this area, and if you can sort of just get us grounded in social equity policy, what is it? What does it look like? And then we can talk and have a conversation beyond how do we now improve and strengthen the existing programs.
Definitely, thank you. And again, I just want to thank all of the panelists. I'm really grateful for the role that each one of you plays in this field, and I'm grateful to be part of this conversation. And thank you for putting it together, because I think that this is really important. This is where the work gets done, the real work. So I completed my thesis on equitable cannabis policy and followed Oakland's equity permit program. My motivation for that was to carve out a space for this field in academia, and I hope that that continues to grow and continues to happen. My second motivation for that was that my original passion was looking at home ownership as a means of economic justice for people of color, and my research was really based around redlining and Prop 13 and how certain individuals in our country benefited from generational wealth that really stemmed from home ownership, that stemmed from kind of the New Deal, and how people of color were adversely affected through redlining and other racist policies, and how home ownership could be used as a way to kind of repair those harms and for people of color to obtain that generational wealth again. In that field, that narrative is kind of dead, especially because just home ownership is ridiculously expensive, especially in California. And the narrative is really being pushed towards renting. But the Greenlining Institute did a lot of research in this field and really has that narrative. The greenlining is the opposite of redlining, and that's the whole theory behind their organization. And they were interested in this topic, and I mean, I really saw this as an amazing opportunity to draw the narrative. It's very black and white, right? People of color disproportionately affected. Literally, there's someone in jail right now while that's a person of color, probably for like just smoking a joint, and there's a person with no background in cannabis, or that maybe even was arrested and was able to overcome all those obstacles and is now benefiting from the cannabis industry. And you just can't argue against that being inequitable, right? So that was my main passion, and then the second part is really the economic potential of this industry. In a lot of social justice movements, we get the same excuse that we're understaffed or we're underfunded or there's just no money in the budget. But this is a really unique opportunity for us to maybe balance our state budget and actually allocate some resources intentionally to help marginalized communities. And I do believe in local control, and I do believe that these tax dollars should be used in very unique small programs. Allocating it in specific programs, I think it's the most powerful way to do it. And I really see, like, the OEG, one of our hashtags is we paid for this. And I really just imagine in the future, like Santa Cruz does have a program where women of color low-income women of color qualify for a program and literally get stipends, like real money stipends, to live and support their children if they're going through a tough time, and that's weed tax money, you know. And I really see weed paid for this as being used as that, as like we're putting this money to good use. And I want to thank Max for really going into that detail of the cannabis supply chain, and I created also a diagram for you to wrap your head around it. And I also created one for equity sessions where we work directly with equity applicants and try to wrap their heads around this. And it's an interactive one where you can go and look at the fees and look at all the different ones. And I could have drawn something really cute with like a distribution truck, you know, and like the general supply chain, but this is the regulatory supply chain that is being imposed upon us, and it is really complicated. This is as simple as I can make it. It's extremely complicated, and I commend people like Ramon, who are really taking this risk and being brave and really wrapping their heads around something that's so complicated. Just me as a researcher, I have to know the regulations in that amount of detail, you know, just to understand what's going on. So to be a business owner, like, it's insane that the amount of information that you have to process every day. There was an existing supply chain, though. There is still an existing supply chain that doesn't look like this. And California is considered to be, you know, the largest cannabis market in the world. So that supply chain is robust, and it's been here for 19 years. It's not going to go anywhere. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, exactly. And it looks like most of our cannabis is produced in Northern California above San Francisco, and most of it is sold in LA. Literally, like most of it, it's like the biggest cannabis market in the world in LA in terms of sales, and in terms of cultivation, it's in Northern California. So we have that supply chain too, that's regional. So there's a problem if kind of like there's not enough cultivation license in Northern California, and there's not enough retail licenses in LA, right? And LA is struggling with that, with the unregulated market, because there's literally, like, for every one regulated or licensed permitted business, there's 10 unregulated ones. And it's just a supply and demand thing. People want cannabis. They need more retail. And if they're not getting it through a license, then they're going to go through the unregulated market like they have for the past, you know, all of their lives. And it's the high taxes at the local bans, right? If half of the map is not allowing the regulated market, then how are we going to have this regional supply chain? How are we going to support it? It's the slow in-state application and permitting process. Like I said, it's very complicated. And then the lack of resources from transitioning from the unregulated to the regulated market. And if you visit my original report, that's something that I really stress that is really necessary in making sure that we don't miss out on these tax dollars. But I do want to reiterate that we're still in an extremely strong market, and that a lot of the hiccups are due to lack of conversations from people who are in power and regulators and people who are on the ground experiencing this. And I think that bridging that gap is really important for us to be able to achieve some fluidity in this supply chain, and really being able to benefit from those tax dollars that are there, and have a stable economy where we can actually use those tax dollars to implement these programs that are well-intentioned, but it's just really hard to implement them. it took generations of damage to get to where we are, and it's going to take generations of repair to try to create some sort of equity. And when we look at equity, like going back to the basics, I'm sure that a lot of you, especially this audience, has seen this image where there's three people and there's a disabled person or a short person, a middle-sized person, and a tall person, and they're all trying to watch a baseball game, and there's a barrier, and they all get a box. And that's equality because they're all getting the same thing, but they need different things. And then there's, well, the tall person gives up their box to the short person, and now they're all watching the game, and that's equity. And it often feels like something is being taken away from you if you come from a position of privilege, because you do have to give that box away to someone who is in need because of the barriers that are in place. And then there's a third one that is touted a lot as well, that is the barrier is removed, right? The fence is not there, and that's systemic change. And that's definitely the lens that we're coming from on the ground as organizers. And I think that the cannabis industry provides, the existing framework is very much from that. It's very different, right? Prop 215, it was the queer community who really it was the medical community really, and the veterans, and those are all the pioneers in the cannabis industry, and the framework already had a system that was about compassion, and it worked. It's a system that worked, and now everyone's trying to adapt to a very new system that merges adult use and medical, so kind of undermines the whole medical field and culture and how it could further develop. So I think that cannabis the industry is an amazing opportunity for us to do things differently, to not just replicate the existing structures and the existing policies that are already failing marginalized communities. I think that it's an opportunity for us to be brave, and to just not follow the same framework. And so I have the projected tax revenue. It originally was like, when it was being sold, it was like, we're going to make $1 billion a year. It's going to be amazing. We're going to be rich. But that number has gone down. But I just want to reiterate, it's a lot of forces in different directions that are causing the market to not be in its full potential, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen regardless whether there's equity or not. It's going to happen. It's just the nature of like economics, and capitalism. And so we still have we're still on track though for raising around like $3 billion a year according to the research in the next 5 years. We're still creating an amazing amount of jobs, and directly and indirectly. I see a lot of movements also now pushing, it's crazy because like cannabis has no HR standards either because it's so new. And so we see that as a drawback. Some people can frame the narrative as a drawback, but for me, I see that as an opportunity, right? We can go above and beyond to what the current HR requirements are, and we can really demand like a fair living wage because it's cannabis, or for equity applicants, or for impacted communities, whatever that may be. And so you see we have 66,951 jobs supported by cannabis in California, and in the nation 296,000. And so I think that's a pretty good chunk. Like I said, California cannabis economy is not going anywhere, and it's gonna generate the tax revenue that we're hoping for. And then I have the third page where it's really just the basics. The most equity permit programs, or equitable cannabis policy framework, currently has equity permit program to benefit individuals who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And there's different criteria that's very similar because a lot of it is based upon Oakland's permit program, but it benefits an individual. And then there is some of that fund being allocated to reinvest in communities disproportionately impacted, which is really key, and I think there should be more of. So like actually working on rebuilding infrastructure in those communities, or having, I don't know, scholarship programs. I mean, I think that's where we can really get creative and get past the cannabis bubble or restraint. And then there's the decriminalization and expungement. So it's really like a three-part framework for how they're currently being structured. And if you visit my research, I had very similar, but I think when I try to evaluate how these policies are being implemented, or I see that there's the missing transitioning from the unregulated market to the regulated market, and having data-driven definitions for data-driven outcomes. And I really think Senator Bradford, because SB 1294 actually requires the jurisdictions to submit a report that says how many owners and how many equity applicants were actually became owners, obtain a permit, and a lot of other data that's going to be really valuable for someone like me who wants to evaluate these programs. Currently, and let me know if I'm going too deep into it, but I think like currently Oakland is not keeping track of like out of the non-retail. The retail is very easy to track, right? Because like, yeah, it's one out of four equity applicants that's currently operating, blunts and more. It's very easy to find that information yourself. But there's also 21 other applications that were awarded to equity applicants in Oakland, and they're not being tracked. So we don't know if they're operating or not, or when they'll be operating. So I mean, I don't know how then. That's obviously something that they have to work on if they got funds from SB 1294 in order to be able to write that report. So I'm really grateful that that exists.
Excellent. Nice. Leslie, thank you so much. That is a fine overview of what programs look like. And so, we're going to pivot. Well, one, thank you all for your subject matter expertise in bringing it today. You've really brought it. And so now what we're going to do, we've got about little under 45 minutes left in the program, and so we want to get into sort of an open-ended dialogue. We've got plenty of questions here, and more questions are coming in from our audience and perhaps even our live streaming audience. And before I get to some of these questions, I actually wanted to check in with Senator Bradford. Senator Bradford, you mentioned one of your bills, Senate Bill 595, and I was hoping that you could elaborate more on 525 and how 525 plays into this broader conversation about equity in this space.
595.
595.
Yes.
Yes.
Again, it provides a fee waiver and deferral for, again, equity applicants. We've heard also well all the barriers that exist, and as Max stated, the multiple number of licenses that are available. So this is a way of hoping to assist those folks. And many times we talk about people of color, we always think they need some kind of business training and they need some financial assistance. But that's not always the case. The barriers here are so complicated and convoluted, it even impairs those folks with a certain skill set. But 595 does want to shine a light and assist those folks who might need some of this financial assistance and to get these licenses and provide the fee waivers or deferrals, because it's multiple challenges here. So this is the first entry point, as we stated. If you can't get licensed, you can't operate. So we're trying to assist at least in starting that, because it's a very complicated market, and if 595 along with 1294 can assist, that's what we're trying to do. So.
And if we could, any of the panelists could address this. If you could sort of paint a picture when we talk about fee waivers and deferrals with regard to permitting and licenses, maybe you can paint a picture on what does that look like? What are the costs what are we talking about? Are we talking about, $50? Are we talking about $50,000? Like, what is that barrier? And what?
I'm pretty sure Max has those figures better than I, but it'd be a whole lot of folks with license if it was only $50. No, they're thousands of dollars and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars in order to get started. So this is going to be a great assistance to those folks who do have financial.
I can just say from personal experience, my small farm, 10,000 square foot garden in Mendocino, my family farm, we've expended probably $52,000 in just licensing alone. So like just start provisional is 11 grand in itself just for that small farm. So like on average, you're probably looking at $100,000 at the very least through all the, not just the licensing and applications, but those changes that you have to make. Like that's a tiny number in the lease. Like most people would average are spending, $250,000 to $1.5 million before they even make a dollar, right?
So significant numbers.
Yeah.
Significant numbers. One question that has come in, and again, this is for the panel, and Leslie, it speaks to a point in your presentation around the need for institutionalizing and normalizing HR practices in the industry. But is there anything in the works as far as legislation that will require cannabis employers to provide health care benefits for their employees? And currently, California health insurance carriers will not write policies for the industry, according to the person who's asking this question.
Sorry, I was actually not familiar with that, so I don't have.
Okay. No, so we're not familiar at this time as to whether or not there's legislation in the works that would require health care benefits it would seem to me that if you're a California state employer, you're required, if you reach a certain number of employees, you're already required to ensure your workers have health care benefits.
But you said exclude cannabis.
What this writer is suggesting here is that health insurance carriers, or the question asker is suggesting that health insurance carriers will not write policies for the industry, which is something we may want to look into. Not familiar with that. How does the here's a question. How does the sale of illicit or illegal cannabis affect the price of legal cannabis or vice versa? Is that something, Max, you think you could take that one?
Max.
Based on sort of what the research is telling us?
So how does the sale and the price of illicit cannabis affect the price of legal cannabis?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I would say that the fact that there's competition on the illicit market has driven, and the fact that we're talking about up to 45% taxes in some cases, and all the regulatory costs. There is the highest demand is there for the lower priced offerings from the licensed retailers, because that is what is more comparable and can compete with the unlicensed offerings that don't have the cannabis taxes, that don't have the regulatory burdens. I think the other factor, though, not on the consumer side, but on the production side, because track and trace still hasn't been fully operational and it's been rolling out. It'd be disingenuous to say that illicit market purchasers don't try to buy from licensed farms, and that there isn't a competition at that side. We're just not there yet with the state tracking systems. We're going to be. This is probably one of the last harvests when there's going to still be that type of active courting of licensed operators, licensed farms by out-of-state or unlicensed distributors. But that competition certainly is an impact, especially when we had earlier this year a CDFA licensing crisis where there are some folks that wanted to get licensed that were having trouble getting licensed and trouble getting their annuals and provisionals, and that's largely cleared up or been clearing up. But if you wanted to be in the legal market, you got your temporary license, then you're without a state license for a while, and yet you've still been growing your crop because that's your livelihood, and you invested so much in the legal market. If you suddenly still at harvest time don't have access to the legal market, then that type of competition, I think, may be more appealing and maybe more prevalent. So I'd say perhaps it's less of an impact on California consumers who are very much more price sensitive and will go to whatever retailer they can find. And if they go online, they believe all the retailers they find are licensed. Well, that's simply not the case. But with the production side, there definitely is illicit market competition for licensed products.
If I can just add, I mean, we know anecdotally that on the East Coast, California cannabis drives a pretty high price. So for purposes of illicit production operations, there's definitely that financial incentive, which will not be solved for until we have a federal solution, or until states, notably on the East Coast, but really across the United States, start to bring online their own frameworks. So that's something I just want to make sure we add to that.
So in addition to fee deferrals and or waivers on the local and or state permitting side, what are some very concrete policies that local government can adopt to ensure the success of the role that they play as local government in the success of equity applicants and or operators? Are there one or two, three concrete things local government can do?
Well, I think I know I've had a lot of discussion on this. One of the major things that we're running into is city attorneys kind of not allocating some of those funds and having the fear of aiding and abetting. And even though the state of California has kind of pushed this, there's this complicated issue of cities releasing some of these equity funds as well. San Francisco, well, there's a couple others. San Francisco is the major one that we're having difficulty in getting those resources allocated out to the actual applicants in creating those resources, because there's basically a dam at the city attorney's office that's really being very, very particular about how they release that. So just on a statewide, just empowering those cities and counties to be able to release these funds without that complicated issue, just kind of supporting them and empowering them to be able to release and relinquish those funds. So when we're talking about 1294, that's a grant from the state to the cities, and so therefore that should be a grant from the city to the applicants, like, when we're talking about the allocation of the refund, these funds. And then the other thing that's been very vital, and the OEG has been working with the industry in creating these type of resources, is establishing, supporting, and creating statewide accelerator incubator programs. So, programs that these applicants can go through that will give them the basic technical information, but also more in-depth information of how to build their business, get it going, and then accelerate their business. When we're talking about the war on drugs and what it impacted our access to education and professional resources. So what's holding back a lot of these companies is access to lawyers and accountants and marketing professionals and number one, real estate, right? And having to hold on to that real estate for now in San Francisco, it's almost 2 years that an equity applicant has to hold on to real estate. By the time they even get approved for their application, they've exhausted their funds, and it's going to be very difficult for them to get into business. So those type of resources that we already have statewide, is just releasing those and allowing those departments to actually work with the cannabis community would be a major step into creating these resources that we need to actually promote these businesses, get them off the ground, and keep them successful.
So one of the pieces you mentioned relative to the barrier of entry here is real estate, and so is there a working model in state government or in local government where in fact local government or state government has used state property or tools of the state to ensure that public properties or properties are available to equity applicants or cannabis applicants? Or so is there a model out there that says, look, here's public property, and for the purposes of running an enterprise, we're going to put this public property up, and this is sort of what it looks like?
I mean, if I may, so I will address that, but I also want to address the last question too.
Excellent, thank you, Nicole.
Just with putting my local hat back on.
Great.
And going one step before that, I would say local jurisdictions need to allocate resources, full stop.
Okay.
Right. So when you think about what those resources could be, that includes staffing to more expeditiously process these applications so that equity applicants aren't carrying the burden of real estate carrying costs, for instance, for so long. I know San Francisco tried to address that by allowing for a letter of intent, but in a market with landlords who want money, they're not going to let a place sit vacant for 2 years. They're going to charge really high market value for that space. So when local, and this is something we saw in LA as well, right? You have to put money towards that program in order, you have to put money where your mouth is. It was definitely what we struggled with in San Francisco as well. So that's one thing I want to flag, allocation of resources in general. And I know in working with Senator Bradford and thinking about the framework of 1294, as we iterate that, there is a nod in that framework now to incentivize the drawdown of local dollars from jurisdictions as part of that application consideration. So really trying to hook them through that too. Partnerships is another thing. So thinking about where you can get pro bono assistance from nonprofit providers in the community or private sector for-profit providers. I was lucky to work in San Francisco where there's a lot of support for that type of effort that needs to be replicated throughout the rest of the state. And that just takes work. Another thing is local jurisdictions can think about system development. And to some of the comments that were made earlier in the early part of this panel, taking this moment in time where we're constructing systems for cannabis and thinking about how we can do that in an equitable way, where we're front-loading that in our system development and then using that and scaling it for other things. But really, this is a great opportunity that we should seize, and we should be front-loading equity in the way that we develop our institutional systems. So those things as well. I will say for land, in my experience, there was never really the conversation, so to the concern around this aiding and abetting concept, right? There's a lot of fear from institutional actors about that. But what I would say is there's also ways to take public land and incentivize the use of that public land. So how can we think about creating carrots for that? How can we think about subsidizing that? I think there's a lot of opportunity space in that area, for sure.
And I would just piggyback on the local issue as well. As a former city council person, I think our biggest challenge is the lack of education by those local elected officials about this industry as a whole. And that what 1294 also encouraged was the hiring of 4 staff people under the Bureau of Cannabis Control, making sure they are staffed up as well, but they need more than 4 people in order to reach out into these communities and educate local government on what 1294 has to offer, and as stated already, putting those resources on the street as quick as possible, just to hold on to them. And one of the things we did with Ms. Elliot and the governor's assistance this year, as you know, the $10 million that we had last year was supposed to hit the street on April 1st. But once we saw the distribution and where that money was going, almost $4 million of that $10 million was going where? Humboldt, a community that has benefited well off the cannabis market for the last 40 years, surely isn't diverse. And we were able to put a stop to that. So we want to make sure that these resources go to those communities that really have a equity program, as we stated in my opening. And again, to assist those cities in better understanding what those resources are and that are available to them and how to best utilize them.
And to go back as well, like Nicole did, just the application process is something that people in this industry spend thousands and thousands of dollars on and hire consultants to assist them in. So even just allocating the funds, I mean, that's the first step that should have happened, allocating funds for the application process to obtain not just the local, but also the state permit. And in terms of utilizing publicly owned land, this is definitely something that I researched for the Plus for Centers and Cities and Schools at UC Berkeley. And it was with the Oakland Unified School District, and it was to look at workforce housing for the purpose of retaining and recruiting teachers. It was about allocating resources in creative ways. If we can't afford to give big raises, can we utilize underutilized or surplus publicly owned land for this purpose? And I think that's a narrative that is still developing, and it's great and should be had in affordable housing. But more specifically in cannabis, I think it's much more powerful because now that we are regulating, we're also rezoning, and we are creating new land uses. So our landscape of real estate is changing really fast, and if we don't secure that real estate soon for equitable purposes, it's going to inflate the same way that it already is inflating, but the same way that home ownership, that real estate for housing, residential zone property is moving in California, right? Because of foreign investment, literally people purchasing the property because they know in 5 years they're going to make a profit. They don't even go look at it. They don't even put anybody to live in there. And that's what causes our real estate to inflate in prices and for locals not to be able to afford it. And that is already happening now in cannabis industry. But we have that opportunity because of the zoning and really the narrative to push for publicly owned land and public-private partnerships. The incubators giving up 1,000 square feet is not enough. And who owns that real estate is what matters ultimately too.
So look, I've got a couple more questions from the audience. I want to dial back to Ms. Elliott when you describe the need to expeditiously process permits, because oftentimes what you have is a landowner, a building owner, a property owner who has held a piece of property in long-term escrow or long-term lease, and as an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur, you've got to make payments on that property typically. So the question is there a role, ought there be a role for the private sector to support in some way equity applicants in this process? So that's, is there a role for them? And then sort of follow-up to that would be, is there a role for government to encourage private sector to work with equity applicants in a way that it is, you're not creating an economic disadvantage for that property owner or landowner?
Yeah, to both. I think that for purposes of expeditiously processing, is there a role for the government to do more in that? Yes. I think the challenge right now is sort of a challenge that we'll probably never face again in this process, which is just that we're moving in a market into a regulated space all at once, right? And yes, we'll continue to do that over time, but the numbers that we're seeing now, we likely will not see at one moment in time ever again. So I think that is a challenge in itself that we just need to acknowledge is real, and we just have to deal with it. As far as getting the private sector to engage in that, yeah, I do think it would be wonderful for the private sector to engage, overall broadly corporate social responsibility, contemplating equity in that space is so important, and we like to highlight when private sector actors do that. I would like to see it just simply be an expectation, right? So incentivizing that type of activity is definitely one end of that spectrum, for sure. But yes, it is definitely something that private sector should be engaged in.
I'd like to address that question as well. The OEG, in our equity push, we kind of never really waited for people or cities or counties or the state to actually allocate resources and funds to what we saw already was a necessary need. So to that aspect, we started equity sessions, which she talked about earlier, which was we created an educational platform to help equity applicants navigate the application process, healing from the war on drugs, understanding the industry, and then ultimately understanding some of those softer skills needed to create a business in general, and then understanding the more technical parts of compliance and everything else. That was something that we advocated from the beginning that should have been provided by the city, counties, and states to you know, be able to ease that effort of equity applicants and kind of counteract some of that lack of access to education and resources. We did it ourselves, and the reason why we paid for it is like San Francisco, working with Nicole, Elliot, she was instrumental in helping us do that, was that a lot of the retailers, pre-existing retailers, had to commit resources to the equity program. So that's where we saw that engagement from the community. Like when we're talking about people making millions of dollars off of something that was illegal, yes, they have an obligation to help equity and help fix this problem, right? And so we were able to take those resources, apply it towards giving these classes for free to the equity community, and in doing that. In the same aspect, I've worked with EASE and a few other big companies to create incubation and accelerator programs. So like EASE just released a Momentum program where they're giving out $50,000 grants. They're helping them with all their technical assistance, compliance, education, marketing, all these different things. And they're starting with 10 equity applicants or disproportionately disadvantaged operators, and giving them those access to the resources and that they need to actually get their thing off the ground, and also access to their media and their market, their, you know, the shelf space, those things that they're going to need to actually be successful once they actually are put in place. So those are the discussions that we've already been having, actually implementing these resources, not waiting. Should the government take a bigger stance? Hell yeah. But like us as communities, we don't wait for that. Like we understand what our need is, and we just need support in getting those resources. Another thing that we just did was with the help of the law offices of Omar Figueroa, pro bono, working with the CDA and NCI and some of the other industry, the Cannabis Distributors Association, National Cannabis Industry Association, the NCIA. The OEG has established an equity trade certification that we have a federal application in for certification that would be, and we need the state of California's support in actually creating and putting this certification out that would identify equity products like a fair trade product, right? So you would have an identifier that would identify these products. You would be able to know that your money and your dollars spent are going towards businesses that were coming out of those disproportionately impacted communities. Retailers and other allies would be able to use that as an opportunity to advertise and show that, and that gives us a way of tracking and understanding, really, are these operators really committing to 20% of their shelf space? Are they really providing these opportunities? We have a very impactful and clear way of identifying those products and just showing how that goes through.
So staying on this theme around sort of what either government or the private sector can do, is there a model, or rather that model be here in the state of California at the local level or anywhere across the country, where government has incentivize the private sector by way of either some form of a subsidy and or tax incentive for that private sector operator or business to work with a cannabis equity operator? So any model around subsidies or
there's no
tax
model
for
for
the private
that.
sector?
I know that we've been trying to come up with ideas of that, like, you know, looking at other industries in San Francisco, for instance, how they promoted the tech industry, was giving those tax breaks and incentives for those companies to come in and do that. And we have, you know, tried to say that would be a way to motivate some of these businesses and to actually provide those type of internal resources.
Senator Bradford, you know, again, staying on this theme, what do you think, or what do you believe would be the impediments to such a scheme?
I only desire to do it, and again, changing our whole mindset of what this industry is. I mean, we still have a whole lot of stigmas and folks who, my colleagues, some of them, this is a non-starter for them. They just don't want to talk about it. But we could use the same model as enterprise zones. And we've done that, and we've incentivized private industries to hire folks, to give tax breaks. It works there. This is another industry, so let's quit looking at it as a standalone or one-off cannabis. Just look at it as a regular business model, and use the enterprise model that has clearly worked for businesses for the last 20, 30 years here in California, across the nation.
Very well. Anyone else want to? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that and echo that. There are existing programs already built to incentivize to reinvest in marginalized communities. There's a lot, and like the new income tax credit is one of them, where people are incentivized to develop in marginalized communities and do mixed, like commercial and housing, mixed real estate, and have and get like a certain tax incentive if it serves the community or there's certain affordable housing in it. And I do think it's really about expanding the narrative in people who using not just the equity applicant criteria to be able to benefit from all of these programs as well, but the other way around in those programs benefiting the new communities that are now defined as disproportionately impacted. Yeah.
And another area that's not being tapped into is the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. I mean, there's billions of dollars that our banks have failed to reinvest into our communities, and this is an area which those dollars could be utilized because they're not being spent. And that's why we have more and more of the payday lenders and things of that nature, because they haven't reinvested in our communities. So here's a way they could show direct impact with some of those dollars by embracing this industry as well.
Yeah, and I had lost my train of thought, but that I think that we should also look at the existing programs that are meant to like reinvest in marginalized communities and see what's not working, see what's working and what's not working, and keep focusing on what's working and fix what's not working, and then implement it into Cannabis Equity and not just replicate, existing frameworks that aren't working.
This may be a bit too soon, but it's a question from the audience, so I want to make certain that you all know that I'm not censoring your your questions here. And I believe Senator Bradford's legislation addresses. But what has been the most effective measure for these programs? What's been the most sort of effective measure in advancing equity programs locally? And I think what I heard earlier was that 1294, Senate Bill 1294 requires some sort of a data collection and research component if you were one of the local jurisdictions that received those funds. But Leslie, I know you've done a lot of work in this space, but do you want to touch on sort of what are some of the methodologies that are currently used to measure the effectiveness of social equity programs in local governments?
Yeah, I think that we're not at a place where we're having that conversation, and we really need to be at a place where we are, or it should have been done from the beginning, as like seen in my recommendations. Oakland is the only program that's the furthest along. LA has just released the application process. And San Francisco, it happened also very recently. So Oakland is the only one that we can look at to try to see how the program is doing, but like I said, they're not collecting any data, so there's no way really to measure. We just know that there's one equity applicant operating so far, in retail, and that they're giving 5 to 100K no interest loans that you have to pay. You have to start paying back immediately once they're given to you. Yeah, I mean, at least they're giving something, and that's all we have. And in LA, there's been only 1.5 million that was allocated recently, and then $3 million a year for 3 years. And this is one of the things where I say, and it had to go through like a measure with the Budget and Finance and Rules Committee, and it had a lot of advocacy had to take place. Do I think that 3 programs in the state who have allocated a couple $1 million for the next 3 years is going to create any sort of equity in this field? Absolutely not. Like, it's ridiculous. We really need to be allocating the appropriate amount of funding and the appropriate amount and the right measures. Really take that seriously, because that's where we always fail. We implement these policies and then we don't know how they're doing. We don't know how anybody's benefiting from them because we're not collecting the right amount of data. So that we really need to be having that conversation. And I've had conversations with Nicole before and with Kat Packer before, and it's just in Oakland, and it's just not something that. Everything's moving so fast, and people are putting out fires that's not something that they have time or capacity to think about right now.
Okay.
So I want to just piggyback on that with my San Francisco experience to acknowledge that the digital licensing process that was put in place for San Francisco actually does collect data around individuals that are applying and the ownership of that. It's obviously a voluntary component. I think there are legal challenges around making that mandatory. But I do know, at least when I left, it was at above a 50% response rate. So we were actually seeing a lot of people participate in the collection of that data, and I think to Senator Bradford's, contemplating this in 1294 as well, that is also an incentive for jurisdictions to start incorporating this into their permitting process. It's incredibly important that they do. I think that data, to Leslie's point, is very important in informing policy changes about who's actually being successful in this space and who's not. So I just wanted to flag that as something as well.
So in the sort of closing moments of today's discussion, I want to touch on 2 pieces. One, Senator Bradford, again, your legislation that is being considered now in the legislature is Senate Bill 595. So we want folks to, we've got a wonderful audience today. Look at Senate Bill 595, do your research, and do everything you can to reach out to your lawmaker and help educate them about 595. Max, is there any, as you look at the sort of legislative calendar and you look at sort of what's before California, is there anything that stands out that you think we ought to be supporting or advancing or advocating around as it pertains to social equity and moving the ball down the field further?
Well, right now, of course, the legislative deadline was the 13th of September, I believe it was, for bills to go pass off the legislative floor. So we're now in Nicole's territory of sign and veto. No pressure.
Those Bradford bills are
I'm telling you.
Yeah, and so that's what 595 is. That's where SB 34, the equity or the compassion bill, is also over there. We're not going to put you on the spot.
Thank you. I have nothing to say. I'm so sorry.
But ultimately, there's a lot of those good ideas, and I'm really excited by what ideas we're going to move forward with next year. And I do think that, and Nicole, from having come from the local government, also understands how the thinking is. I do think there's a space to go and help use equity. I know Senator Bradford started talking about not wanting, equity to sort of be the grease, or really folks just doing equity in name only and just taking the funds and abusing it. I would say that if there's a way to go and have a conversation around the broad cannabis policy goals such as expanding the legal market, expanding local licensing, and doing it in such a way that new licenses are issued to equity operators and equity retail operators, it could go and fulfill both goals. It could fulfill market development goals, and it could fulfill goals of intergenerational wealth development, and having a full range of communities be featured and accessed in the cannabis industry. So I would say there could be a conversation, level of conversation next year about how equity can be used and funding with equity can be used to encourage equity retail as a way to try to open doors with retail.
And I'll just speak to another piece of legislation that got held up in Senate approach this year is SB 698, and that's our emblem bill, and it helps to identify for those consumers putting an emblem in a shop so you know that's a legal operator, similar to when you go into a food restaurant and it has a grade of A, B, or C. I think that's going to be critical. It's going to help in understanding, again, who legal operators are, where those safe products are, as we heard about the vaping products that have pretty much been underground, but also to, again, encourage those operators to come above ground. They often say it's the black market, but if it was a black market, it would be people looking like me running it. It's not. Right. So we want to show who's legal and who's not, so folks feel comfortable on where they're spending their money, where they're buying their products. So hopefully we'll be a little bit more successful next year. It's a 2-year bill, so hopefully we can move it along.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Thank you to our esteemed panelists here for sharing their wealth of knowledge in this space. I want to thank especially the Center for California Studies and all of our wonderful participants, both here in the room and in live stream. This has been a very, very important conversation. It's an ever-evolving discussion. We're overwhelmed by the level of interest generated by this movement. We invite you to stay engaged, stay informed, and stay active as we work to build a more equitable California. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, as well. Just wanted to let the folks know who are live streaming. Many of you sent some fantastic questions. We obviously couldn't get to all of them today, but know that we will keep that information and we will share it with our panelists so that they know what you had to say. All right? I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact the center about today's event, but know that your comments, suggestions, concerns, issues will be sent to our panelists as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I saw her last week, I saw her this week, and we'll see her next week. But yeah, I know.
Yeah, man. I know I can count on you guys' support for our equity trade certification.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Now, if I can get the
Yeah, that felt great.